Our young heroine hated it more than anything when unpleasant rumors were spread around her. But her small body was so weak that the girl could only listen. Therefore, the maids were spreading gossip as much as they could, even though they were genuinely concerned about the condition of the Duke's daughter. Since it was not yet time to demonstrate her abilities, Daphne Archeon could barely contain her anger. The assistants were so inattentive that they did not notice the condition of their young mistress. Surprisingly, the little girl patiently waited for the arrival of the person she needed, on whom she was going to take revenge. The heroine had a grudge against her father, since she was previously a great dragoness named Celeus. Therefore, the former dragoness harbored a grudge against the man who, in a past life, killed him with his own hands. The speech was specifically about the hero Hieros Archeon, who, by chance, was the father of the new body of Celeus. This made the heroine bite the lips of her new shell hard, not realizing how weak she was. And none of the maids could help the young lady, because they didn't even know who was hiding inside her. So the great dragoness had to play the role of Daphne Archeon in order to stay alive. This made the girl's blood boil furiously, but she could not change her situation. The little girl hated the hero so much for her death that she did not even want to look at him with one eye. Whenever Hieros wished to meet his daughter, her cries of protest echoed throughout the estate. There were only 5 dragons in this world, who always brought prosperity to people. But there was also another little-known dragoness, whose very name made everyone fear her. This is because every time there was nothing left alive in her path that did not try to resist her. So this dragoness was nicknamed the Great Disaster, and it was she who appeared to the heroine in her past life. She enjoyed the carefree life in the body of a dragoness, when no one could do anything against her. Even Celeus herself believed that her reign would last forever, because dragons live a long time. But this was exactly until the arrogant hero came for the head of the Great Disaster. Hieros was a truly strong knight, so only he had the strength to defeat this monster. No matter how the heroine resisted, she soon realized that this man was protected by great powers. Then she struck him with magic one last time, although even that could not save the immortal dragon's soul. All because the hero came not for victory, but to seal Celeus forever. The last thing the dragoness remembered before falling asleep was the bloody face of her enemy. The heroine considered it extremely unfair that everyone around her had been trying to kill her since birth. So she swore that she would definitely take revenge on the hero who had imprisoned her so mercilessly. To Celeus's surprise, she did not die in the literal sense of the word, as she was able to hear someone crying. The heroine did not immediately realize that her soul had moved into a new body and was therefore able to survive. This vessel turned out to be the Duke's little daughter, who suffered from an incurable, fatal disease. So when the dragoness took over her body and woke up, she didn't even suspect it. The young lady was surprised by how weak her captured body was. Previously, the heroine would never have chosen such a goal, but she had no choice. Besides Daphne, the assistants were no less surprised, since the girl was considered dead. But by some miracle, the baby opened her eyes again. Although her father didn't care, literally within a few days, the Duke's new daughter was able to fully acclimate to this body. But the dragoness still hated her face very much, because it reminded her of the hero. Until now, no one even suspected that Celeus was in the little lady's body. But the Duke was not at all happy when he learned that his daughter was actually alive. The heroine was embarrassed by this fact, since she was Hieros's only relative. The dragoness was not very familiar with human families, but before they seemed much closer to her. However, the fact that the hero was not interested in the baby gave her complete freedom of action. So the heroine was going to reach heights in a short time, with all the knowledge from her past life. Of course, the dragoness's plans included the overthrow of the arrogant Duke, who had imprisoned her great body. At the thought of her victory, Daphne involuntarily broke into a joyful and anticipatory smile. True, the dragoness still hasn't fully studied the young body she accidentally ended up in. She was constantly haunted by the feeling that the past power was blocked by a dam. Imagine the heroine's surprise when she learned how weak a creature she had become. The girl began to scream in rage about this, since even magic was not enough in her. Suddenly, at that moment, blood started flowing from the mouth of the little girl, who had accidentally overdone it with emotions. The heroine had no idea what to do in such a situation, since she had never been so weak, so she stared in confusion at the liquid on her palms that continued to come out of her mouth. But the maids turned out to be much more accustomed to such moments, so they immediately rushed to help. Before losing consciousness, Daphne heard what her assistants were quietly whispering about. She couldn't believe that the young Archeon's body was actually infected with a deadly disease. Many years ago, a great sage tried to warn the dragoness about a similar case, but at that moment, Celius considered his words nonsense, so she threw the scoundrel away. And now she deeply regretted those actions, because she knew nothing about her condition. So now the heroine had to deal with the terrible illness of her new body. However, the maids were extremely reluctant to talk about this disease, fearing their mistress's reaction. Therefore, the lady did not immediately know that she was infected with the terrible black butterfly disease. The heroine remembered that this disease was more of a curse sent by dark magicians. When the full butterfly pattern appears on the victim's body, he will die without the possibility of salvation. And on her body, Celius discovered this very mark, which meant that she was cursed. But none of the assistants could say for sure why Daphne died at such a young age. It seemed as if someone had erased the maid's memory of the time when the lady became worse. This surprising circumstance interested the Duke's daughter, because it was too strange. She was absolutely certain that one of her ill-wishers had killed this body before she appeared. But what bothered the heroine most was that the memories of those around her about that incident were erased. Only dark magicians, whose identities were unknown, could have pulled this off without anyone noticing. The maids tried their best to help the Duke's daughter, but they could do little for her. But the assistants made Daphne happy by saying that no one yet knew that she had returned to life. The only thing that angered the girl was that the Duke had given the order of silence only because she could die again. The little girl still couldn't contain her rage when it came to mentions of the hero she hated. The maids interpreted their mistress's emotions in their own way, attributing them to her not being in a very good state. But soon a famous elf named Tady Incy was supposed to arrive to help Daphne. The guy was delighted that such rich aristocrats had invited him for a consultation. But as soon as he approached the young lady's door, he froze in horror because of the energy behind the door. The elf was ready to swear that he felt the powerful aura of the dragon, although the Duke would never have allowed this creature near him. Celius noticed Tady's presence, so she opened the doors herself for the man, who stood frozen in place. Inseek could barely suppress the wild desire to close the doors again, just so as not to see the dragoness. Elves were always better than others at sensing the aura from souls within bodies, and Tady was no exception to the rule. However, the invited Incy had no other choice, no matter how scared he was. The guy immediately began to compliment the dragoness so that she would not do anything bad to him. The heroine was always quick to respond to pleasant words, so she quickly broke into a satisfied smile. The little girl chose this elf as her first real helper, because she needed friends. Teichi was too afraid to object to Celius, even if she was in such a weak shell. But Daphne didn't expect the doctor to have questions about why she chose this body. The girl quickly lied that she was just having fun, which made the elf genuinely delighted. He was glad that he was able to recognize such a great dragon at first sight, which confirmed his skills. But even such a skilled elf could not help when it came to the dark butterfly's illness. Celius knew for sure that she was not mistaken, because she had heard a lot about her illness from the maids. But the black butterfly was a powerful curse that was rarely cast upon anyone. So the heroine had to find the answer to the question of who needed to curse her body. The little girl felt it was unfair that she had to die again so soon. The elf sympathized with the great dragoness's situation, but could do nothing to help her. All he knew was that the girl could be held responsible for the actions of her heroic father. Hieros represented the face of the sun, which each time conquered the terrible night in the world. So his actions could well anger the dark magicians who needed this darkness. And the power of these powerful wizards was more than enough for a powerful curse. Therefore, in this confrontation, his daughter had to bear full responsibility for the hero. Teichi had long known that Hieros was cursed for fighting against magicians, and now his entire family was in danger. But even after all this, Daphne could not understand why exactly she suffered. Incy did not expect that the dragoness would wish the same for the other children of the Grand Duke. Only now did he realize that Celius had entered this body without knowing its terrible nuances. Besides Daphne, Hieros also had several other children, each of whom could receive an inheritance. But the heroine didn't have the chance to communicate closely with them, so the lady didn't care about their future. The situation was that only the young lady was the Duke's real daughter, and the rest were adopted. So now the lady is forced to suffer alone because of the affairs of a father who did not love her. This only made Celius even more angry, even though it was dangerous to her health. It turned out that the Duke could not look at his daughter only because his wife died during her birth. The dragoness found this reason incredibly insignificant, although Hieros stubbornly clung to it. Even the elf agreed that many people were selfish and arrogant by nature, but Celius had no intention of leaving the impudent Duke's life in peace while she slowly died. Many aristocrats disliked Duke Archeon, even though he was recognized as a hero. This is because Hieros was originally a commoner and earned his title through hard work. Therefore, at the weekly meetings, many aristocrats openly showed their hatred for Archeon. This manifested itself most often in the fact that they argued with all of the Duke's proposals without making any of their own. And Hieros had to listen silently to every opinion, no matter how much these people irritated him. Only Marquis Guéron, who was a close assistant to the Duke, defended his friend and skilled leader. But it was precisely for this reason that many soon stopped respecting this man. Meanwhile, Guéron's character was explosive enough that the Marquis could not contain his emotions. In contrast, the aristocrats hid their feelings well, which gave them a sense of moral superiority. So all of Archeon's close associates could not prove the need to help the common people. Then the Duke reminded everyone present that not long ago, angry people had burned down the Marquis's estate. So Hieros was just trying to convey to everyone around him that it was necessary to take care of his neighbors. The man grew up in similar conditions, so he understood perfectly well what it meant to be poor. He lost his temper completely unnoticed, and only the hole in the table from his fingers hinted at the hero's state. Seeing this, one of Archeon's assistants tried to change the subject to something more peaceful, but even so, the man could not calm down and leave alone the poor table, which had already suffered. A sudden knock at the door made the attendant turn around, interrupting an important meeting among the aristocrats. The heroine burst into the room so quickly, as if she were a real tornado, and not a little girl. She was determined to stop her father in order to at least restore some justice for her death. But Hieros didn't even blink an eye. Even though his daughter was doing her best to disrupt the important meeting, the man had been unemotional since childhood, so it was not difficult for him to ignore the little girl. And Daphne was so consumed by the desire for revenge that she did not pay attention to anyone around her. She was ready to explode at the sight of the hero's calm face, who did not attach any importance to her hysteria. All because this man didn't even try to be a real father to his almost dead daughter. And even now, after all of Celius's angry words, the Duke did not feel even a drop of remorse. So the heroine quickly realized that she would not be able to break through the man's insensitivity in this way. Therefore, she gave up trying to reach Hieros, because she only came to declare war on him. Daphne forgot how weak her current body was, and boldly attacked her father in front of everyone. Archeon had no trouble blocking his daughter's weak blow, no matter how unexpected it was. But the man didn't expect to encounter the powerful rage in the eyes of the lady who promised to kill him. Hours after the meeting, the Duke still couldn't get the incident out of his head. The assistants saw the gentleman's thoughtfulness, and therefore remained silent, since it was better not to touch him. Marquis Guéron remembered that Hieros had been cursed by a dark mage, and therefore felt almost no emotions. But Daphne's behavior still influenced the man, who had previously tried to avoid the little lady. The only blood heir of the Archeon family never had a warm relationship with her father. Since her childhood, the Duke had avoided speaking to the lady because she had taken the life of his beloved. Moreover, Daphne's character left much to be desired, because due to constant pain, she took it out on everyone around her. As a result, the Duke had no choice but to move his daughter into a separate extension to the estate. No one expected that Daphne, having returned to life, would immediately begin to loudly remind everyone of herself. So one of the Marquis's assistants was sure that something interesting awaited him in his old age. After this stormy speech, Celius felt much better, because she had spoken out. She was already glad that she was able to declare war on the hero, even if he did not take it seriously. Taking advantage of Daphne's good mood, Teiichi tried to escape, as he did not want to serve her. The dragoness immediately guessed the real plans of the elf, who had already tried to leave her many times. However, Insish did not have the courage to directly tell such a great being that he was leaving. So every time Teichi would come up with some incredible excuse, but Miss didn't believe him. The girl did not pay attention to her assistant's torment because she was worried about her own death. Hearing this, Teichi was horrified because he would hardly be able to find the real killers of the young lady. But it turned out that the dragoness didn't need Incy for this at all, which made the guy noticeably relax. The only thing the elf needed from the baby was a medicine that would allow the body to recover faster. But the guy's skills were not enough to carry out the complex order from Lady Daphne. However, he was so afraid of death that he did not dare to refuse the young lady her complex wish. Celius was pleased that part of her problem had just been solved so easily. So now the dragoness had to become stronger in such an insignificant human body. Literally the next morning, the maids were horrified by what the Grand Duke's daughter had decided to do. They did not believe that the girl was truly behaving calmly, considering such behavior to be the calm before the storm. First of all, the girls noticed that Daphne no longer threw objects at anyone out of anger. The girl also began to act as if she was much older inside, although small on the outside. But what surprised the maids most was that the little girl went to training for the first time in her life today. Some of them heard Daphne calling for her father in her sleep, so they decided that she was trying to get his attention. Because of such thoughts, the misunderstanding between the heroine and her assistants only increased. Celius herself hoped to squeeze out some useful mana particles from herself, at least in the yard during training. The dragoness refused to believe that a body completely incapable of magic was enough for her. To awaken her great powers within this body, the little girl took with her a special mana stone. She absorbed this element without fear, although her young and weak body could not withstand its power. And immediately after this, incredible pain consumed the entire existence of the Duke's daughter, which she did not expect. The girl cringed with a terrible feeling inside, unable to overcome the powerful energy of the stone. The heroine barely remembered how to properly concentrate energy within herself. But even this barely helped the little girl, as the pain from taking the mana was tearing her apart from the inside. As a result, the heroine, with great difficulty, spat out some unpleasant and black liquid. Immediately after this, the dragoness discovered that her stats had increased significantly without this thing inside. Zelius did not miss the opportunity to once again praise herself for her genius and sharpness of mind. She has always been an arrogant dragon who easily succumbed to any compliments. But Daphne's joyful state did not provide answers to the question of what kind of liquid was in front of her. Just in case, the girl collected some of the liquid so that the elf could later examine it. But the Duke's daughter was never able to start training because a distraction arose. Previously, the dragoness would have mercilessly killed anyone who dared to do this to her. But now the great Celius was in the body of a child, so she could do little to resist her enemies. And the enemy turned out to be the most arrogant of the Duke's adopted children, whose name was Arius. The boy was clearly hostile towards his sister, with whom he had never communicated before. And now he was once again convinced that the girl was nothing good. Arius couldn't believe that the lady was still standing. She was so pale. So he arrogantly advised Daphne to return to her room, as if he were the master. The Duke's adopted son did not expect that his usually screaming sister would answer him differently this time. So he didn't even have time to defend himself from the strong blow that landed right on his cheek. Zelius believed that she had done absolutely the right thing and did not feel any pity for the arrogant child. Previously, the father did not dare raise his hand against the son whom his deceased wife brought into the family. Therefore, Arius did not know how to react to the next rudeness from the little lady. But the heroine did not want to acknowledge this boy as her brother, because he did not love her. In the past, the dragoness often reached out to people, wanting to secretly learn how strong families lived. She watched with envy the sincere and warm smiles that radiated from everyone around her. So Zelius learned that real family will be there no matter what happens. And Arius didn't fit that description at all, because all he did was bully his sister. Moreover, the boy did not perceive the girl as his relative, even though they were related. So he set about reclaiming the training ground so that Daphne would go away. But this was not part of the heroine's plans, which she openly demonstrated to her impudent brother. Arius could not bear such humiliation, since no one dared to declare war on him. But Daphne didn't care about the honor of a boy who didn't show her an ounce of respect. Not wanting to lose to the girl, the Duke's adopted son swung at her with all his might. But at that very moment, the fight between the children was interrupted by the knight's commander, named Lloyd. His appearance greatly limited Arius's actions, because the boy did not want to be punished. However, the anger towards his sister was much stronger than reason, so the boy started arguing again. But the commander could not allow fighting without rules on his territory, so he stopped the children. Daphne sighed sadly, as she was sure that the man would not allow them to compete now. But Celius was sorely mistaken, because Lloyd threw the children a couple of wooden swords for practice. The man demanded that the brother and sister quarrel according to all the rules of knights on the training ground. The dragoness didn't expect that the family she would end up with would be so crazy. Arius joyfully grabbed the sword, because he had no doubt in his victory. But he didn't yet know that Celius was a true swordmaster in her past body. So the heroine was completely prepared to defeat her older adoptive brother. Daphne was confident that under Lloyd's watchful eye, nothing would happen to them anyway. In fact, the man had no doubt that the boy would teach his sister a good lesson. He had heard more than once how the young mistress offended the maids, although there was no reasonable reason for it. Therefore, the commander assigned Arya the role of the people's avenger, since no one else could touch the lady. Naturally, the knights quickly gathered around to watch the little Miss's downfall. Lloyd could see from people's faces that they did not feel sorry for this young and spoiled girl. But no one expected Daphne to be able to hold a sword as if she was born with it. The commander couldn't believe his eyes, because the duke's daughter had the most perfect pose. The whole thing was that many years ago, Celius pestered a skilled swordsman. Grandfather was considered a master of the sword, but he had no intention of training a dragon in human form. However, he couldn't bear to see his swords handled so ignorantly. Despite the fact that Celius had excellent strength and speed, she was unable to block the blow. In fact, at that moment, the dragoness was genuinely interested in noble swordplay, and in her crazy eyes, the old teacher noticed this gleam, and that is why he agreed to teach Celius. All his life, the old man treated the craft he had studied since childhood with pride. It was this fire within her grandfather that interested Celius, so she became his student. This is how many years ago the difficult everyday life of the dragoness who was learning fencing went. In the guise of a woman, she tried her best, but even this was not enough for the merciless teacher. Celius had never spent so much time training her human form before. However, the grandfather grumbled that the dragoness had still not come close to the title of swordmaster. But the teacher was ready to support the student for as long as she needed to learn. So at that moment, the heroine had no opportunity to give up and leave fencing. For the first time in her life, the dragoness felt the joy of having found someone close to her. Every day, she woke him up early in the morning to spend time studying together again. But a dragon's lifespan is many times longer than a human's, so Celius found herself in an unpleasant moment. At first, out of habit, the girl didn't even realize what she was facing on a cloudless and beautiful morning. But the old man's cold body told the heroine that she would no longer be able to talk to the teacher. During her time as a student, Celius had forgotten how short human life was, and here before her lay the old man who had taught her so much, but who could no longer help her in any way. The dragoness had never descended into the human world before, so she didn't know what she should do. She was at a loss at the sight of the dead old man, whose cold body was only a reminder of his existence. What hurt Celius the most was that she didn't know the teacher's name, and that's why she didn't descend into the human world. Even after much time, the dragoness could not understand why death overtook the old man so suddenly. For the first time in her life, the heroine suffered from the death of another person, who was not even a relative of hers. For several months, she visited her teacher's grave every day, until it became too unbearable. The result was that the girl hid deep in the mountains, where she continued to hone her skills, and all this was in order to at least momentarily dull the pain after the death of the old teacher. In her new body, Celius no longer experienced any torment, so she could confidently take up the sword again. Moreover, all the dragoness's blood burned, wanting to prove that she was an excellent swordsman. So the duke's daughter boldly rushed into battle, without thinking about the possible consequences of this battle. The only thing that saved the girl was that she really did have a perfect stance, which she had perfected in her past life. Therefore, Daphne was easily able to swing with all her strength at Arius, who had already been knocked to the floor. But the heroine completely forgot about one important thing, which concerned the state of her endurance. So in the end, it was Celius who lost this battle, no matter how good her skills were. None of the knights could believe that such a talented lady had lost simply because of weakness. But the duke's daughter herself really couldn't move a finger, so there was no talk of a fight. The adopted son froze in complete shock and didn't even think to help his little sister. Even Lloyd didn't realize that the young lady would need help, as she was too tired from the fight. The only thing that bothered the boy was that Daphne's stance and strikes were almost like those of a swordmaster, despite her age. Anger instantly flared up inside him, because Arius was sure that the lady had not even picked up a sword. But everyone around could see how this girl, with her skillful actions, almost beat her brother. If Daphne had not fallen exhausted, the persistently training Arius would have definitely lost to her in this fight. Meanwhile, the child trained so much and so hard that all his hands were covered in scratches and his body ached terribly. But the commander of the knights saw that the boy had no intention of stopping at the progress he had made. Seeing Daphne's talent, Arius only wanted even more to be the one called the Swordmaster in the future. So from now on, he mentally declared his sister as the first rival to be defeated. The maids were predictably horrified at the sight of the little girl who had brought herself to such a state. They started running around the girl in panic, completely forgetting that this could not help her in any way. As soon as the heroine came to her senses, she began to think about how to build up her strength and endurance. But the lady's affairs and duties prevented the dragoness from finding a way out of the current situation. It turned out that the commander of the knights wanted to meet the lady in person, and she did not refuse him. Daphne knew perfectly well that this man worked for her father and could not do anything bad to her. The man still couldn't get Lady Archeon's stance and swordsmanship out of his head. However, Celius would be lying if she said that she took up a sword in this life, because that was all in the past. This amazed Lloyd even more, deciding that the little girl clearly had natural talent from her father. But Celius couldn't properly train the skills she had acquired in the past in this body. This is all because the girl's little stamina was only enough for walking not too fast. However, Lloyd was confident that Miss would be able to improve her endurance if she trained every day. But the state of Daphne's body resembled a vase that was already covered in numerous cracks. As much as the commander regretted it, with the duke's daughter's illness, it was impossible for her to become his successor. As soon as Lloyd walked out the door, Celius gave in to her emotions, because she wanted to kill the hero, not replace him. So the very next morning, the maids had to watch the selfless lady with anxiety. The girl stubbornly walked quickly around the arena until she fell down again without strength. But each time, the information window about Mrs. Powers told her that her endurance had increased. Even Arius began to worry about the little girl, who did not at all feel sorry for her insignificant and weak body. But the heroine was so passionate about the desire to become stronger that no one could stop her. Daphne was genuinely happy with every attribute point she earned with such difficulty through training. Of course, this progress in training was also influenced by Taichi's potions, which the heroine forced him to make. The dragoness planned to increase her former strength as quickly as possible in order to take revenge on the hated duke. Suddenly, a polite knight commander joined the stubborn girl's training. He was grateful to the lady for the fact that her morning run had raised the morale of all the knights. But the little girl herself didn't even notice how much her zeal influenced the people around her. It turned out that the guys were inspired by the sight of the little girl who never gave up on any given day. Therefore, regular fencing training has resumed on the training field. The commander was surprised that the knights were so inspired by the behavior of just one girl. Meanwhile, Daphne was trying her best to become stronger, because otherwise it was impossible to achieve her goals. Otherwise, Celius would not have been able to take revenge on the hero, something she has not yet told even Lloyd. The commander knew that the girl was under a terrible curse, which the duke asked not to tell anyone about. Therefore, few people knew the pain that the little lady had to face every day. However, recently, the knights began to care about the efforts of Daphne, who was destined to die. Lloyd knew he couldn't ask the little girl to improve, but he wanted to see her achieve. The commander could only hope that the lady would not consider his words inappropriate for the situation. But Celius was delighted that someone had shown her the respect she deserved. Even without the knight's request, she was going to become as strong as possible in order to achieve her goals. But even such a great creature needed time for good rest after training. However, the little girl did not expect that, at the very moment of her fatigue, someone would demand a fight again. It turned out that Arius wanted a rematch with his sister, and he didn't care at all what condition she was in. If Celius could move, she would definitely have smeared this boy across the wall. The child was saved only by the fact that Daphne's body had completely weakened after long training. The girl irritably admitted her weakness, just so that her stepbrother would leave her alone. But Arius had no plans to retreat, as he wanted to prove that he was better. The boy was ready to swear that the lady looked much better than she had a couple of days ago. Only now did the heroine realize that the child had correctly noticed that her endurance had increased. But out of spite, Celius still did not want to communicate with the boy, sending him to others. However, Arius had long since realized that no one in this place wielded a sword better than his sister. That's why the boy insisted so much on seeing at least Daphne's pose. Naturally, the dragoness was pleased that the child respected her so much for her fencing. The girl immediately broke into a cheerful smile, as the compliments worked well for her. Celius wasn't against teaching the boy if he could ask her for it normally. Arion was used to everyone fulfilling his demands the first time. But this didn't happen here. The dragoness had many opportunities to humiliate the boy with just cruel words about him. The child himself understood perfectly well that his mastery of the sword still left much to be desired. Therefore, he had no other choice but to fulfill all the demands of his caustic sister. No matter how angry the boy was at his helplessness, he still whispered words of help. In the end, Celius was pleased with the number of compliments she received. She immediately began teaching the boy, who even had problems with standing. No matter how hard the child tried, he couldn't repeat everything his sister said. The girl herself understood that without a personal example, Arius would hardly be able to understand her. So she took up the sword and demonstrated what she wanted to see from the Duke's adopted son. Seeing her stance and sword strikes, the boy immediately remembered the strong and great heroes. He had put so much time into training with the sword, but the lady got it almost the first time. But the girl still had her own problems that no one could help her solve. One moment Daphne was feeling great, and now she couldn't stop coughing up blood. The little girl vaguely remembered that the elf had warned her about the possible consequences of his potions. However, Teiichi himself did not perceive the side effects as something serious for his health. And in the end, the dragoness felt as if she was about to die again in this body. So once again the baby lost consciousness because she couldn't cope with the illness. As soon as Celius came to her senses, the desire to beat Incy flared up in her with renewed vigor. But Miss was in no hurry to go in search of the elf, as she discovered that she was feeling better. It turned out that Teiichi's potions worked perfectly, even through such complex recovery paths. Therefore, the dragoness's endurance increased several times in just one night of unconsciousness. But because of this incident, the knights did not allow the girl to resume training after fainting. Although all the tools for practicing skills had long been located on the site near the estate, but the boys were worried that Daphne might pass out again if she started training. Such resistance was not part of the plans of the lady, who hated being interfered with in any way. So Celius couldn't even contain the rage that was bursting out of her entire young body. It was impossible not to be frightened by such a sight, but the knights were able to resist the anger. Therefore, they declared that the Duke's daughter would only be able to enter training over their dead bodies. Even if someone changed their mind about sacrificing themselves in this way, the majority was against the lady on the court. But none of the boys expected that the girl would actually draw her sword against them. Celius was glad to practice her skills again, even if it meant causing some harm to people. The knights were saved only by the fact that the little girl was distracted by conversations related to the commander. It turned out that aristocrats had come to Lloyd and demanded that he give them Arius under his guardianship. These people didn't know how to take refusals, so they came with the firm intention of taking the boy. But Lloyd's conscience did not allow him to act so cruelly towards one of his best students in fencing. Moreover, the commander did not have time to finish the last training session with Arius, who was doing well. However, the aristocrats did not value the boy's education in terms of physical strength. From the outside, all these arguments seemed stupid and selfish towards his brother, Teuchelius. The dragoness did not plan to interfere in these conversations, since she was already tired. But then the little girl noticed the silhouette of a boy who silently hid from these people behind a column. Arius heard all these cruel conversations very well, which did not take his opinion into account. He understood that he was forced to bear responsibility for having once become the son of a Grand Duke. And the aristocrats pressed precisely on these points, being confident that they could win. But none of them took into account the young lady's interference in the affairs of impudent adults. The count was very scared, because just recently he had spoken badly of this girl. What angered Celius most was that these people were bullying a small and helpless child. So she loudly declared that Arius belonged only to the family of the Grand Duke Archeon. Daphne had no intention of giving her brother to anyone, even if she didn't have much contact with him. Hearing these words, the boy quickly wiped away his tears, as they greatly encouraged him. But that wasn't the end of it for the aristocrats, as the lady had no intention of letting them go. The men did not expect to fall into the clutches of a young lady whom they could not refuse, and Daphne took full advantage of her power, as she ordered them to carry out the punishment. So all the arriving guests stood on their heads in panic, just so as not to anger the girl even more. Celius made sure that none of the aristocrats dared to take a little rest. Even the commander did not dare to object to Daphne, no matter how strict her demands were. The dragoness sincerely could not understand why people's status was so important to them. She herself lived her whole life far from social conventions and never worried about it. Suddenly, Arius appeared in front of the girl's face, barely able to hold back his tears. But what struck the heroine most was that the boy suddenly thrust a small bouquet into her hands. In this way, the child awkwardly tried to thank the lady for taking his side. Recognition was always important to the Duke's adopted son, but his father did not give it to him. Only while Eliza was alive did the boy hear pleasant and warm words from the kind woman. But after her death, much changed in Arius's life, and sadness forever took possession of his heart. He was haunted by the fact that he had once lived on the streets and was no better than other poor people. And the Grand Duke did not support the child in any way, as he was consumed by the death of his beloved wife. Suddenly, the boy heard the words he so desired from the mouth of his little sister, whom he almost hated. From that moment on, the anger in the boy's heart forever gave way to true love for Daphne. That's why he personally selected the most beautiful flowers to bring at least a little joy to the little girl. Arya felt awkward thanking the lady after everything that had happened between them, but he thought it was the right thing to do. Although there were still many unspoken things between them, the beginning of reconciliation had been made. Of course, Celius couldn't accept the fact that her brother had become kinder to her so quickly. But for the boy, she truly became a lifelong savior in this cold estate. In order not to offend her first subject, the dragoness gratefully accepted the bouquet. In fact, Celius didn't care about such gifts, but she always respected people's efforts. Therefore, the heroine reported that the boy embarked on the path to developing his self-esteem after this gift. Arius had no idea that his regret combined with forgiveness could do so much good. It was the first time he had seen his sister's genuine smile, and she seemed truly beautiful to him. However, old habits still prevailed, and the lady's advice somewhat angered the child. His confession reminded Miss of the time when everyone around her assumed she was terrible. But this time, Arius still took the Miss's words into account, as he wanted to apologize to her. For the first time in her life, Celius realized how nice it was to have someone listen to your advice. Even the knights enjoyed watching from the sidelines the little arguments between brother and sister. A few days later, the heroine was again happy that she had been able to increase her indicators. The little girl was eagerly awaiting the moment when she would become strong enough to start fighting. Lately, Arius has been stubbornly following the lady in all her training, while also exercising. At first, the constant company of the noisy boy even irritated the dragoness, who was accustomed to silence. But now she considered him her full-fledged ward, and even missed him a little. However, not everything was as smooth in the heroine's life as it was when she was a great dragon. But for every situation that she didn't like, Zelius found her own methods of punishment. That's how Teichi fell into the lady's hot hands, and he didn't have time to explain to her the side effects of the medicine. Moreover, the heroine could not contact Insik for several days, who hid from her for a while. So the lady came up with a plan where she would learn the magic of the elves and be able to find them everywhere. Teichi tried to justify himself until the very end, but all his words still sounded extremely pathetic. In the end, the elf could not bear it, and accidentally admitted that he hated his young mistress. The dragoness's contemptuous reaction was not long in coming, something anyone should fear. So Insi gave himself his punishment before Celius told him again what to do. The heroine would never have thought that elves could be so careless and crazy. But she still needed this guy, so the little girl had no intention of harming him in any way. She only threatened that she could take away from the elf part of the essence that was important to them. The elf, who was deprived of this miracle, could no longer feel nature and even died. So this threat immediately affected Teichi, who could not live without a connection with plants. His pleas for mercy could be heard throughout the outbuilding. But the lady remained cruel. The only thing that could save Incy were the stones that would be filled with his magic. The elf didn't understand how his energy could suit the dragon, but he didn't ask questions. This task was quite feasible for the guy, so he was sincerely glad about the simplified task. But Teichi didn't expect that the girl would demand almost 100 mana stones at once. Even he had a hard time reproducing such a quantity, but who would dare argue with the great dragon? Because of this task, Insik almost forgot to tell about how things were with the medicine. During the days that he hid from Daphne, the elf managed to create many different samples of the potion. Eventually, he managed to create a liquid that could release Mrs. True power. True, the medicine required some improvement, as its period of action was still too short. It turned out that Incy was glad that he was able to create a potion that lasted at least 10 seconds. But Celius, who had previously used her power constantly, did not appreciate such joy. So once again, the poor elf had to accept punishment, although he tried his best. A few hours later, the young heroine finally set off on a short journey with the elf. This mountain was located close to the Duke's lands, so the miss was able to make this journey. She could feel with her whole body how strong the elven magic was in this place. Of course, the dragoness was unhappy that she had to try so hard because of a stupid assistant. But Daphne could train her mana, which is why she left the estate for the elven forest. Tady had to keep an eye on the perimeter around the girl to make sure nothing happened to her. He still couldn't understand why the great dragon would use such a weak body for entertainment. No matter how many times Incy asked about it, Celius never gave him a clear answer. For a while, Daphne couldn't concentrate on the training because her assistant next to her was bothering her. And Teichi wondered why fate had brought him together with such a dangerous and cruel creature. After a few hours, all the heroine's business in the forest was finished, as she had leveled up well. The little girl was able to raise several of her mana stats, which made her noticeably happy. The elf was nearby all this time and successfully protected the miss from unnecessary animal interference. But then Daphne heard cries for help coming from very close to her. But Teichi did not interfere in human affairs, so he suggested that the girl return to the estate. He did not consider it necessary to help people whose meeting could not bring him any benefit. But Celius had a different opinion on this matter, because she had tried to save people before. It was for this reason that the heroine often disliked elves, who were too selfish. And even now, Teichi could not believe that the lady had decided to save those unknown people nearby. The dragoness considered it her great mission to help the family to which she had recently belonged. In this world, there have always been natural causes and effects that replace each other. So, there were situations when some evil dragon destroyed cities for fun. Many people died in such moments because they were insignificant before such crazy forces. But justice always returned everything to its place, because many evil deeds turned into good ones. The exception always concerned only Celius, who was considered the embodiment of disaster and evil. Therefore, the emperor ordered the duke to deal with the dragoness, who carried only malice within herself. And now that the heroine had changed her body, she could get rid of her terrible and unpleasant past. The opponents immediately noticed the little girl, who calmly walked out of the forest towards them. As Daphne looked around, no one perceived her as a worthy threat. So the enemies were already rubbing their hands at the thought of how much an aristocrat's child could cost. The knights tried to fight, but their efforts were not enough to defeat their enemies. So one of the selfless guys shouted for the lady to run away as quickly as possible. His strength lasted only for a few seconds, because then the enemy dropped the knight to the ground. The mercenaries turned out to be so strong that they easily dealt with the entire detachment of knights. No matter how hard the boys resisted, they could do nothing to help the little child. So the evil hands of the bandits were already reaching out to the lady for whom they could receive a ransom. But the heroine had completely different plans, so she drank the potion from the elf. Thanks to this, Daphne unlocked her power and could now defeat every enemy. So, after just a few minutes, people realized with surprise that they were free. All the opponents were defeated and lay on the ground, and they had no strength left to resist. The guild leader thought that death had overtaken him, But this lady changed his future in an instant. Daphne dealt with the enemies using only a wooden sword she picked up from the ground. But even this weapon was enough to defeat all the powerful mercenaries. Therefore, the potion's 10-second duration was enough, and all the good people were finally saved. The little girl was pleased with the effect of the potion that the elf had recently invented for her. The leader's name was Eddard, and he could not help but introduce himself to his noble and young savior. As he approached, he immediately recognized the daughter of the Grand Duke, for whom he had worked for a long time. The man was glad that it was she who saved his squad in such a difficult situation. Zelius didn't expect that this grown man would suddenly start thanking her non-stop. Before, the heroine had never encountered sincere gratitude, because everyone was afraid of her. But now that the dragoness was in the girl's body, people perceived her personality differently. For many centuries, Zelius had not heard compliments, even when she saved people from disasters. But recently, more than one person has thanked her for the good deed, which was done by accident. Only now did the heroine realize that the reaction to her had changed due to the change in body. So now the girl could abandon the nickname of disaster, because no one perceived her that way. Previously, the dragoness would have given a lot to at least once receive sincere recognition from people. But then the excited Teichi tore the young lady away from her thoughts, since there was no time for that. Once again, the elf forgot to tell Daphne that major side effects were about to happen. At first, the Duke's daughter did not understand what was being discussed, because she felt quite well. But then blood spurted out of the baby's mouth again, even though she hadn't even managed to move. Insik realized in advance that in a few hours, he would again face a cruel punishment for this. When news of the attack became known, the assistants promptly reported it to the Grand Duke. Hieros immediately suspected the possibility of an information leak from within, which could not be denied. This incident greatly disturbed the gentleman, as something like this had never happened before, and even the Duke's best thinkers could not say exactly what and when went wrong. The Grand Duke carefully recorded the incident in order to better understand it later, but he didn't believe that his daughter was able to defeat her opponents with an ordinary wooden sword. First of all, Hieros believed that Daphne would never have just helped in such a situation, so the man needed to personally sort out the motives of his nasty-natured heiress. The hero did not have any hope that the lady could suddenly change her behavior. During her sleep, the heroine remembered the past, when she found a fire as a great dragon. Celia struggled to put out the fire, as best she could against the raging elements. Even ice magic was unavailable to her, because then the people who hid in their homes suffered. Therefore, the dragoness called on all who wished to survive to come out into the fire so that she could protect them with her magic. But no matter how loudly Zelius screamed, not a single person came out of the burning house in the village. In the end, everything burned to the ground, and all the inhabitants of this small village perished in a terrible and powerful fire. And only the heroine, who took human form, remained a living witness of this horror. She set out to search for survivors as soon as the flames stopped devouring other people's buildings. However, everywhere the girl found only charred corpses, which she was unable to help. Many died right in front of the door, because they were too afraid of the dragon to go outside. At that moment, Celius finally realized that she was a real disaster for everyone around her. But now, being in the small body of the Duke's daughter, Daphne experienced completely different emotions. People with joyful smiles on their faces generously thanked her, even for the smallest help in their affairs. It was this pleasant moment that ultimately swept the terrible dream from the subconscious of the heroine, who was fast asleep. She herself did not expect that she would need recognition from selfish people so much. Until now, Zelius had not come to terms with the idea that she was no longer a terrible disaster for anyone. But as soon as the little girl opened her eyes, her mood immediately dropped through the baseboards. All because, for some reason, the Duke was sitting next to her bed, and he hardly communicated with his daughter. But this time, Hieros was determined to find out the answers to questions that only a lady could explain. As much as Daphne wanted to drive away her sworn enemy, she had to endure his presence. The girl was pleased that as soon as the Duke found out the answers, he would immediately leave her alone. The hero tried to behave aloofly with his daughter, because that was the agreement between them. Since childhood, the girl hated the moments when her father tried to show her love ineptly. And now these emotions have become even worse, because Daphne's body has been occupied by Celius, which makes her hate Hieros even more. Therefore, the man had no choice but to continue to keep a distance between them. It turned out that Eddard was transporting an important relic of the Archeon family, something the lady was completely unaware of. But Daphne was not interested in knowing what kind of gift her father had received from the dragon as a present. She had once been a dragon herself, so she understood how important such things were. The Duke was also interested in why the little girl suddenly stood up for people unknown to her. No matter how much Daphne insisted that she was simply helping the weaker, Hieros could not believe such an explanation. This is all because the man observed his daughter throughout her life and remembered her as a cruel person. Previously, the girl could raise her hand against her assistants if they did not satisfy even one of her wishes. Even the curse that caused Miss Pain and was the cause of her outbursts of anger remained in place. So Hieros was asking himself questions, while the heroine tried her best to get him out. His daughter's aloof behavior once again gave Archeon the idea that she might be plotting a devious plan. The man's memory of little Daphne's constant hysterics was still fresh, and each time Hieros could not calm his daughter, because due to his curse, he did not feel emotions. But this did not stop him from giving gifts to the lady, although his father rarely even remembered her existence. Although Daphne was suspicious of the hero, she still accepted the recently rescued relic from him. This item turned out to be a magic lamp that restored its owner's strength during sleep. Before leaving, the Duke hinted to his daughter that it was for her health that he had ordered this relic from another place. Celius couldn't bring herself to thank the hero for his help, because this thing could have helped her significantly. But the anger towards Hieros inside the dragoness was still stronger than the gratitude in return. The only thing the heroine couldn't understand was why the man presented her with a gift in such a strange way. At the same time, events were taking place in a pastry shop that was popular among aristocrats. But many came there only because there was a secret gambling establishment in the basement of the building. It was there that high society people spent a lot of time exchanging the latest rumors. And this time, the topic of discussion was the situation in which the Duke's daughter saved the people who were transporting the relic. Women were especially impressed by this story because they loved stories about heroes. It so happened that Eddard was also a member of the secret club, so this time the attention was focused on him. The man couldn't help but be glad that at least in this way he had increased his popularity. But he deliberately didn't tell about Daphne's adventures right away in order to gather more people around him. And so it went on until a man in a cloak offered him a good drink of alcohol. The aristocrat did this in order to force Eddard to share what he had recently seen. And it worked. So the women prepared to listen attentively to this amazing story. The strangest thing was that the leader of the Duke's Guild hired the best knights for his mission. But even their skill was not enough to deal with the attacking enemies. And just at the moment when Eddard was saying goodbye to life, he was suddenly saved by a little girl. Until now, no one could believe that the rumors about the Duke's daughter's feat were true. This is all because Daphne was previously known for her bad character and only scolded her subordinates. The most questionable fact was that the girl had poor health since childhood, and the man confirmed that immediately after the battle, she suddenly became worse, causing Daphne to lose consciousness. While Eddard was telling his story, the man in the cloak continued to listen attentively to his every word. But soon the whole story was told, so that nothing else interested the man in this place. It was the great sage Seo Sen, who traveled such a long way to gather information about the dragoness Celius. A few days later, the maid happily burst into her mistress's room with interesting information. But the heroine found herself in a rather unpleasant situation during her absence, so she wasn't ready to talk right away. The baby's body became so weak that she could barely move her limbs consciously. However, Celius recovered even faster than she initially expected. The heroine did not want to admit that the gift from the Grand Duke, which had been delivered recently, had played a role in this. Daphne still hadn't accepted the fact that Hieros was her father, so she tried to ignore him. It turned out that the assistant had so joyfully brought an invitation to a ball at the Finch family estate. But the dragoness didn't understand why the girl was so happy about just one piece of paper. The whole point was that the young lady was invited to a ball for the first time in the last 6 months of her social life. Because at the last event, Daphne behaved extremely cruelly towards the children. That day, the girl fought with many children because of the bad mood that often haunted her. Since then, some of the children of aristocrats held a grudge against Daphne, so no one invited her to the ball. So far, instead of the banquet, the heroine was only interested in news about her cunning assistant. But since his last departure, Teiichi has not sent any news about the development of the drug. Celius needed to achieve great power to punish Insi, so she wasn't going to lie around in bed. As soon as she arrived at the training ground, the lady immediately felt much better. Like a true dragon, her attention was quickly drawn to something shiny a few meters away. It turned out to be a stone with mana, which the girl needed so much to restore her energy. The little girl looked around carefully, but did not find the owner of this thing around. But for the heroine, finding such an item was a stroke of luck, since Teiichi had difficulty bringing them to the estate's outbuilding. So Daphne, without thinking about how it got there, collected such a useful stone. Immediately after this, she raised several more, not paying attention to the fact that they formed a path. Celius was so engrossed in her work that she didn't immediately notice how a man appeared next to her. Out of fear, the girl hit the stranger. Although there was really no need to do so, the green-haired stranger predictably fell to the floor, wincing from the sudden pain in her face. But the dragoness didn't feel guilty for attacking someone she was seeing for the first time in her life. What came as a surprise to the young lady was that the little lady did not remember her identity. The dragoness usually ignored people who didn't give her nice compliments, so she didn't care who the girl was or why she was trying to talk to her. Suddenly, the elder lady confessed that she was the adopted sister of the Duke's daughter. This little girl's name was Befera, and she did not appear before Daphne for a long time, out of fear of being beaten. The girl suffered from low self-esteem, so she wasn't sure that Daphne would accept her. She honestly admitted that a lot of time had passed since she had the opportunity to communicate with people. That's why the emotions on Befera's face now looked creepy, because she couldn't control them. Fortunately, the dragoness did not succumb to such manifestations, since she knew little about people. In fact, the Duke's adopted daughter had come all this way to ask for something. She spent the whole night thinking about how to get Daphne's permission to introduce her to the elf. So the girl didn't believe it when Celius immediately gave the go-ahead for this strange acquaintance. Befera clearly remembered that Hyros's real daughter hated her for various reasons. This is all because, at their first meeting, Daphne made it clear that her sister was very ugly. But before, the green-haired lady herself did not think that there was anything wrong with her appearance. She was afraid that she could be kicked out at any moment, so she did not confront the impudent Daphne. So quite often, Befera received serious wounds from the girl, which she hid from the maids. The lady dreamed only of living again in this sad place with her mother Eliza. After her death, much changed in the life of the child, who was no longer loved. As a result, the girl locked herself in her room for several years, not wanting to contact anyone anymore. And so Befera once again decided to meet with the lady who could brutally beat her again. That's why the girl couldn't believe for a long time that Daphne didn't refuse her request. But the lady had no idea that her sister's body actually contained a great dragon. Therefore, Befera still feared severe punishment from the Grand Duke's little daughter. Celius didn't like the fear she saw in her new acquaintance's eyes. Therefore, the dragoness said that she was not going to hurt the lady unless she was against her. Befera found it difficult to accept the fact that Daphne would actually be on her side from now on. But the girl missed the warmth of her loved one so much that she was already smiling happily. Then the dragoness remembered that she did not know why her sister wanted to meet the elf. It turned out that Befera had had the herbs for a long time, but she could not make a potion out of them. Celius immediately advised her sister to contact the dwarves and noticed a change in emotions. The green-haired lady sincerely hated these creatures, who had not helped her properly. Daphne had to listen to all the righteous anger that poured out of the mouth of the enraged miss. Eventually, Befera calmed down on her own, realizing that she had given in too strongly to her hot emotions. The heroine guessed that this girl had a talent for potions, since she had already created them. The problem was that the arrogant Teiichi was unlikely to agree to teach a human. So Daphne voiced a condition to her sister for help, and Befera was ready for anything. The dragoness needed to know all the weak points of the hero and her relatives in order to prepare. The green-haired lady couldn't understand why the little girl needed this information, but she provided it. Befera was glad that her sister had become calmer, but she was worried about the consequences of her actions. Literally, the next morning, the knights were amazed at the changes that had taken place in Daphne. The girl trained hard from an early age to become much stronger in a short period of time. She was able to learn from Befera that all three children were adopted into the family by the Duchess. That is why Hieros did not maintain communication with them after the death of his beloved and beautiful wife. The man left the estate only to receive an order from the emperor of the country, and the last order was precisely the destruction of the great dragon named Celeus. So it was not the hero's desire at all, but he could not resist his sad fate. The dragoness was known to be a real disaster, so the duke could only imprison her. Therefore, it turned out that the ruler of the state was responsible for the death of the heroine. The little girl still couldn't understand what she had done so badly to the emperor in her past life. Her soul was torn apart by rage at the thought that the poor dragoness was not allowed to live in peace. Most of all, the girl cursed her good-for-nothing father, who didn't even pay attention to her. That is why Miss tried so hard to get her weak body in order. Soon, Teiichi returned to the young lady and brought with him a number of mana stones. But Daphne, as expected, was dissatisfied with such an offering, since she had asked for much more. To justify himself, the elf began to talk about how it had become much more difficult to extract these stones. But all of Incy's words seemed to the dragoness like a real lie, which he skillfully invented. However, the lady did not punish the assistant yet, which made him incredibly happy. But what came as a surprise to Teiichi was that the girl could also be worried about something. The more the dragoness communicated with the elf, the more he irritated her. But there was no other way. Lately, the little girl had been increasingly remembering the dark magicians whose victim she became due to her father's fault. Rumors of Daphne's greatness spread quickly, so her opponents must have known about her. And now the heroine did not know at what moment and from where she should expect the next blow. Even Teiichi no longer doubted that the mages were trying to kill the duke's daughter for some reason. Celeus could only hope that the elf would have at least some clues about her case. But all Incy could come up with was that the plot of her story could be suitable for a book. A small physical and fair punishment for the elf was not long in coming. Daphne was in no position to tolerate her assistant's crazy antics any longer. The lady couldn't find answers in the outbuilding, so she needed to somehow get into the duke's estate. What surprised her most was that their family's main building was not surrounded by any barriers. The elf was especially sensitive to the magic that literally permeated this place. The only remaining possibility was that the captured enemy would never reveal any information. In this case, only the great sage, whom she once drove away, could help the dragoness. So the task of finding Siosen remained on Insiha, no matter how difficult it was. The dragoness's tone was so icy that it left no room for objection. So Teiichi had to agree to the task, even though he wouldn't be able to make medicine then. But the great heroine had foreseen this moment, since not long ago she had found an apprentice for the elf. For Incy, it was a real shame to teach a human, because his race did not do such things. Therefore, at first, he courageously began to argue with the lady, just so as not to play the role of a teacher. Everything changed as soon as the girl said that she would free the assistant if he succeeded. More than anything in the world, Teiichi dreamed of getting out from under the dragon's control, so he could do anything. Therefore, the lady quickly and easily agreed with the elf to teach her sister potions. A few days later, it was time for that very ball at the Marquis of Finch, to which the heroine was invited. Because of this event, there was panic among the maids from the very morning, because they did not have time to do anything. The dragoness silently endured the rapid preparations, although she did not understand the need for them. At some point, the little girl even suggested making her look for the ball a little simpler. But the assistants did not consider this option, because their mistress was obliged to shine. So Daphne once again had to bravely endure all the preparations for the banquet. Meanwhile, at Finch Manor, the Marchioness prepared her daughter to welcome guests. This girl's name was Briss, and she had fully learned how to behave with Lady Archeon. The mother was pleased with her daughter, who knew what to do to suit any mood of the Duke's daughter. In fact, this invitation was risky for the Marquise, but she could not miss the chance. All the newspapers were filled with news about the recent feat of the young Lady Archeon, and Madame took advantage of the opportunity by inviting Daphne to a party with the children of aristocrats. But this was also her daughter's first ball. So many things could have gone wrong. As soon as the banquet began, it became clear that the Duke's daughter was very late for it. So many aristocrats approached the Marquise with questions about Daphne because they wanted to see her. The Marquise fully shared the wishes of her acquaintances, as she herself was interested in communicating with the lady. But among high society, There were people who did not believe in the abilities of the young lady, and one of the counts began to spread rumors that the girl could not cope with the bandits. No one could argue with his words, because something like this had truly never happened in life before. Moreover, the aristocrats remembered Daphne's poor health, which did not allow her to fight. It was precisely this circumstance that the Count emphasized when he insisted that the rumors about the Duke's daughter were false. His words made many doubt whether Daphne really had accomplished the recent feat. Only the Marquise stood up for the girl, since her sudden popularity benefited her. The woman reminded them that they couldn't say anything until they had checked the little girl's skills themselves. But then a whisper spread through the ranks of the aristocrats as the long-awaited guest arrived. Celius looked around haughtily, because she didn't know how to behave among people. Many noted that her pale skin truly indicated the poor health of the Duke's daughter. But the lady's curiosity was stronger than any prejudices, so they wanted to communicate with the lady. Thus, the dragoness, without wanting to, became the center of attention at the Marquise's small banquet. At first, the baby was confused by the huge amount of noise that was pouring from all sides. Besides, for some reason no one dared to approach her, so Daphne was alone. But the heroine came to the ball hoping to find helpers, so she noticed a group of children. The girl was the first to turn to them, as she could no longer tolerate being ignored. But the dragoness's sweet smile made the blood run cold in the veins of the people around her. Therefore, the children were even more frightened. Although the heroine sincerely tried to attract them, none of the kids wanted to meet the girl who had previously beaten all her friends. The longer the awkward silence between them lasted, the more Daphne became angry. But then Bryce, who had remembered all her mother's instructions well, entered into conversation with her. The Marquise's daughter was able to find the strength to introduce herself to Daphne, whom many feared. She boldly conducted a conversation with the Duke's daughter, hinting to everyone else to join her words. Zelius was pleased that the children were simply afraid to speak to her person first. Bryce confirmed every word Daphne said, no matter how strange it seemed to her at that moment. The girl even managed to persuade her friends to agree with Archeon in everything. The best conditions were created for the heroine, so that her good mood would last until the evening. And the dragoness didn't even think of resisting the respect with which everyone around her showered her. The girl was genuinely happy at how friendly the children of the aristocrats turned out to be. But this pleasant moment was cruelly ruined by a teenager who was not going to tolerate such a thing. This boy wanted revenge for a recent disgrace, because Daphne had once broken his nose at a meeting. So the Duke's son challenged the lady to a duel to prove to everyone that she was a weak child. Celius didn't even think of paying attention to the arrogant guy who ruined her holiday. The only thing that bothered the dragoness was that the guy accidentally pushed Briss, whom she liked, to the floor. And the Duke's son was already drawing his sword to fight his opponent in a fair duel. He was completely confident of victory, because in many ways he was superior to the young lady. But the heroine didn't even look at the sword offered to her, because she could have won anyway. She had no idea that this guy's father had sent his son to her on purpose. Duke Brown hoped that the obedient heir would easily deal with the impudent Daphne, and thus he will destroy all the false rumors about the lady's greatness, which he did not believe. The man was sure that pride and arrogance would not allow Daphne to refuse the fight, but his son had recently received a knighthood, so he would never have lost. Thanks to the efforts of the heir, the Duke was going to shatter all rumors about Archeon's daughter into dust. So Hieros will get what he deserves, because many will turn away from him after his daughter's loss. This is exactly what Brown dreamed of, having long envied the hero, who was more successful in all matters. The boy who was sent played his role perfectly and thoroughly angered the Duke's young daughter. So Celius couldn't help herself and accepted his challenge, even though she thought it was stupid. But in the end, it was the lady who angered the teenager by calling him a stupid child a couple of times. Miss ignored all the boy's cries, because she considered them unworthy of herself. No matter how hard the guy tried, the dragoness still wasn't going to play by his rules. Therefore, the Duke's daughter loudly declared that she would defeat the boy even without a sparring sword. Brown's son did not need much persuasion, and he was already running as fast as he could towards the lady. Daphne had no intention of dragging out this fight, so she easily pulled a small handkerchief out of her pocket. It was with this that she quickly stopped the enemy's sword, and he was unable to do anything. The boy didn't expect that the rumors about the little girl's incredible abilities would turn out to be true. so the outcome of this battle was determined even before it began. But only the heroine knew this. During the battle, Daphne quietly whispered that the child still needed many years of training. For the first time in his life, the Duke's son suffered such a swift defeat for which he was not prepared. In full view of all the aristocrats, the teenager lost his balance and collapsed on the cold floor. The guy still couldn't get his head around the fact that some little girl had defeated him. In fact, the dragoness got involved in this fight only because the guy offended her friend. She didn't notice that the aristocrats were watching the short duel with admiration. Only Duke Brown was upset by his son's loss, as he had hoped to humiliate Daphne. But in the end, the lady appeared before everyone as a real hero, because she proved her skills. Bryce was delighted that the previously evil lady had entered the battle just for her. The heroine did not attach any importance to her actions, because she only acted as she thought was right. But due to the expended energy, Daphne urgently needed food, which she asked Bryce to bring. Only after all this did the heroine notice that people gradually began to approach her. As much as the dragoness loved attention, she didn't need it now, so she ran away. Only on the balcony, with the fresh air, was the girl able to completely relax. In fact, the lady was exhausted by this maneuver, but she was able to hide this fact from the aristocrats. The little girl was so tired that she didn't immediately realize that she was not alone on the balcony. But the heroine was visited by the great sage himself, who knew about the soul in the body of the Duke's daughter. Celius instantly lost her temper at the sight of the insolent grin of the hated Sen. But the man himself only smiled joyfully at such an emotional reaction in his honor. True, the meeting did not take place face to face, since the sage sent only a projection in his place. But this took away the lady's opportunity to hit the impudent CEO in the face with a righteous fist. This time the man didn't have much time, so he couldn't tell the dragoness everything, all because many years ago she herself sent him to another continent out of emotion. But Sen managed to give Celius advice that she needed to find out the reason for her death in the form of a dragon. And then the heroine will come closer to solving the mystery of why she ended up in the body of the Duke's little daughter. The man was openly amused, because if he told Daphne everything directly, it would be uninteresting. The sage came only to remind the dragoness to fear dark magicians in this life. Previously, these people worshipped the great disaster, considering Celius to be better than anyone in the world. It is for this reason that they sacrificed their lives to increase their power. But the girl remembered that now the magicians should be too weak to harm her. However, Sen was not so sure about this, so he advised the lady to find her real body. The man spoke so mysteriously that he left the heroine with even more questions. Eventually, he disappeared, although the girl was against remaining in ignorance any longer. Celius could not forgive herself for being so weak that she could not catch the sage. But then a powerful earthquake distracted the little girl from further cursing towards CEO. The Duke's daughter barely managed to grab the railing to keep from falling from the balcony's heights. Only Celius could see that the entire estate was being saturated with death energy from the dark mages. So the sage's prophecy came true so quickly, although he did not expect it. Inside the estate, the shaking was no less severe, causing many people to succumb to a terrible panic. Only the Marquise remembered in time that the children of the aristocrats were in another room. But some adults were so afraid for their lives that they did not want to listen to a reasonable woman. The Count, who most of all did not want to die, grabbed one of the estate's butlers. He demanded that the assistant take him outside immediately, despite the chaos around him. The man had no intention of dying so soon, but then a tangible piece of stone hit his head. The aristocrat immediately became angry, because he could not tolerate being treated disrespectfully. Only Daphne dared to bring to his senses the brazen adult who thought only of himself. The little girl sternly reminded everyone that every person in this building wanted to survive, but they had to help each other. The aristocrat would never have thought in his life that he would be shamed by such a young child. Although many adults were at a loss in the emergency situation, the lady behaved with extreme confidence, so she gave orders to the Marquise to begin gradually bringing the children out nearby. The woman did not have to be told twice, as she had long been ready for action. While the adults were helping the children, the heroine chose a more difficult and dangerous mission for herself. She also pushed the kids towards the exit, but was constantly looking for the source of dark energy. But that place was so far away that Miss was not sure whether she was approaching it. Along the way, Daphne found children who could not do anything without the help of adults. Although the babies were fine, they were too scared to look for a way out. Meanwhile, the flames of the fire grew stronger with each passing minute, consuming the estate. Zelius didn't expect that this element would spread so quickly in the room. She was only worried about the girl next to her, who could inhale the smoke without a headscarf. The heroine remembered very well how fragile human children were by nature. All these kids did not deserve to die in the dragoness's opinion. They were just playing in the hall. But Miss couldn't get everyone out on her own, so she again turned to adults for help. Count Milan responded selflessly to the call as he helped all the people in the building. While the fire was blazing, the dragoness tried to do everything to ensure that no one died in its flames. The heroine looked around carefully, searching for those who were unable to escape the fire. Milan soon returned for the baby, as he had already managed to help the others evacuate. He pulled the lady along with him because he was worried that she would not be able to walk. Daphne noted that this man was a good person, because he helped many people during the fire. But the Count didn't expect that the little girl would refuse to go out with him. The dragoness's plans included a full and thorough inspection of the burning estate of the Marquise of Finch. The little girl did not notice that she was also wounded during her mission, as she did not feel pain well. It so happened that the Count was responsible for writing the newspapers, so he was going to tell everyone about the lady's feat. But right now, he picked up the stubborn girl in his arms to save her from the fire. The man ran as fast as he could towards the exit, as he was sure that there was no one else left inside. But the heroine could not allow the kind Count to decide her fate without her knowledge. So the girl broke free from Milan's tenacious hands, also because she heard a child's cry in the distance. The heroine could not allow any child in this place to suffer at the hands of magicians. Meanwhile, the great hero was defending his territory from the influx of terrible monsters. Heroes fought as if he knew no fatigue or weakness, causing the monsters to retreat. His assistant ran around in a panic, carefully writing down all the characteristics of the unusual creatures. Never before had the knights encountered such chimeras that suddenly attacked their territory. The secretary could only assume that these creatures were artificially bred in a laboratory. And now, the hero was once again faced with receiving another reward for defeating a strange enemy. But the man knew that he had not actually defeated the root of the problems, which were the dark magicians. His closest subordinates knew very well how much the Duke hated these people. The Magi took much from Heros, sending a curse not only on him, but on his entire family. So in this situation, the assistant did not dare to contradict the master, even if he was illogical. But before they could return to the estate, a massive earthquake shocked everyone. Heros, better than anyone else, sensed the dark energy that belonged to his sworn enemies. The man didn't expect the magicians to act so quickly that they would reveal themselves right now. But the secretary's plans did not include dealing with the consequences of the dark opponent's magic. So he was prepared to ignore the fire that was coming from the direction of Finch's estate. Only the Duke remembered that it was there that his daughter had gone today for a banquet with the children. Therefore, he walked in that direction to provide assistance if needed. Meanwhile, the heroine was still trying to find the child crying somewhere in the fire. But the raging elements made it difficult for the girl to search, as they filled everything around. No matter how hard it was for the lady to think because of the smoke, she still stubbornly did not retreat. Daphne couldn't afford to give up when she suddenly noticed her desired goal just nearby. The remaining girl was Briss, sitting alone in the huge hall in the center of the fire. The Marquise's daughter was noticeably surprised that someone had come for her through the fire. The dragoness patronizingly announced that she had come to save the young lady. But it turned out that Bryce was not just sitting there, because her leg was stuck between the stones. However, the heroine quickly came up with a way to save her new friend. Since Daphne didn't have the potion with her, she had to use all her strength to lift the stone. And as a result, Bryce's rescue was successful, as the girl was able to escape from under the rubble. True, the heroine's hands were damaged so badly that she didn't immediately notice. The Marquis's daughter was worried about this, although the dragoness never paid attention to cuts. Both girls hurried to the exit as the fire began to consume the mansion faster and faster. On the way, Daphne heard that Bryce was trapped under the rubble only because she was looking for lost people. Celius considered this nobility worthy of her assistant, which made her noticeably happy. Bryce never thought she would receive praise from Daphne, whom everyone feared. But at that moment, the Marquise's daughter felt truly happy, despite the fire. However, the heroine did not have time to find a way out, as she felt dark energy around her. The only reason she hadn't noticed her before was because she was focused on saving her new friend. But now the dragoness was absolutely sure that the source of the evil aura was nearby. Daphne carefully crawled under the table, where she discovered a completely inconspicuous box. Briss didn't leave her savior's side for a second, so she could clearly see the thing she had found. However, the girl had no idea that the Duke's daughter had found a bomb with dark energy under the table. For the first time in her life, Celius encountered this object, which could not be neutralized in any way, and only the dragoness understood this perfectly, since she felt the energy from the bomb. Everything would have been different if she had not been created with the help of powerful dark magic. But now everyone outside the estate could also die from the explosion. So all of Zelius's efforts could have turned into a huge tragedy, as they always did. Realizing the full danger of the situation, Bryce was the first to give in to tears, as she was a small child. But the heroine still resisted her terrible fate, which the magicians had devised. Suddenly, the dragoness realized how she could save all the surrounding aristocrats. The thing was that the dark energy fit perfectly with her past dragon nature. So for Daphne, this bomb was like a magical delicacy with the ability to level up. So the girl cheerfully told her friend that she was going to detonate this bomb and swallow it. The heroine hoped that the little girl would have time to escape past the debris when she began her actions. Celius herself could not leave with Briss, because she needed to stop the wave of magic. The Marquis's daughter, with tears in her eyes, headed for the exit only when Miss pushed her. The girl could not understand how the Duke's callous daughter could sacrifice herself like that. She had no idea that this whole situation with the bomb was only playing into the hands of the cunning dragoness. So for Bryce, this lady became a real heroine, because at first she stood up for her, and then she went through powerful fire and smoke just to save her new acquaintance. Therefore, although the little girl could not help personally, she was going to bring adults to help. Meanwhile, the heroine has already prepared to extract dark magic from the dangerous bomb. So, just a few minutes later, another powerful explosion was heard inside the burning building. The aristocrats retreated in horror, knowing full well that the estate could no longer be saved. And at that moment, everyone could see how Lady Daphne was trying to contain the magical energy. The dragoness tried her best, but her body was too weak for this power. Before, Celius would have had no trouble absorbing this energy, but now she was obviously having trouble. The heroine tried to contain the magic within herself until the very end, so that no one would die from the explosion. The lady was afraid that people around her would die again, and she would not be able to do anything about it. Gradually, the girl got used to the fact that those around her stopped considering her a disaster, and the heroine would like to continue to maintain this pleasant status in the eyes of others. More than anything in the world, the dragoness did not want to again face the emptiness in her soul after the death of others. So she desperately fought against the powerful energy that was trying to break free. No matter how feeble Daphne's strength was, the girl did not retreat in the face of death. But the baby's body was failing her, as it could no longer withstand the absorption. Suddenly, a bright sword pierced the air, and in an instant the darkness was gone, as if it had never been there. Celius had never been so happy to see holy magic around her. It turned out that Hieros arrived just in time to save his daughter and the people outside the estate. The man affectionately praised the girl who so desperately tried to save the aristocrats. But the Duke did not expect that the little girl would suddenly show affection towards him, stretching her hands forward. The lady's face lit up with a joyful smile, although she couldn't really focus her gaze. The only thing was that the heroine saw her increased indicators. Meanwhile, the rest celebrated their victory, although they were unaware of the real danger. The Marquise, with tears in her eyes, hugged her daughter, whom she had already thought dead in the fire. Bryce excitedly told her mother about how Daphne bravely rescued her from the burning rubble. Even Count Milan confirmed that the girl really did behave like a true hero. The Marquise could not even imagine that inviting Archeon to the ball could turn out to be beneficial for her. Previously, everyone had only heard rumors that the young lady had changed recently. The only thing the aristocrats didn't know was how the little girl managed to cope with the dark bomb. Only the Count was able to remember that the aura of the magical object reminded him of the terrible energy of death. So it turned out that the girl saved everyone not only from the fire, but also from the terrible explosion that followed. The Marquise had no idea how the young lady had managed all this, or whether she was still alive. At that very moment, the Duke carried his daughter out of the building, which only vaguely resembled an estate. But the heroine was in such a deplorable state, as if she was about to die again. The assistant's jaw dropped when he saw her, because the little girl had never brought herself to this level before. The Duke had no idea how to help his daughter, although he managed to save her from the burning building. As soon as the secretary said a word about the possible death of the lady, he heard a noise behind him. It turned out that all the rescued aristocrats hoped that Daphne would be okay. The man was confused, as he had never encountered such a rush regarding a lady's health before. But the Duke paid no attention to the possible consequences associated with the girl's condition. No matter how much the assistant tried to explain it to him, Hieros did not remember how weak the children were. In fact, the Duke was worried that the dark energy could affect his daughter's body. He saw clearly that the baby had still managed to absorb some of that deadly substance. The people around continued to shout that Daphne was now a heroine to them, and it was strange for the famous hero to hear that his daughter was called that way. So he quickly called for an assistant, since he could no longer bear the words of the aristocrats. While the Archeon family was leaving, people continued to joyfully see off the unconscious girl. Daphne looked worse with each passing minute, but hopes for her salvation had not yet faded. This night, the full moon was in full swing in the sky, creating a mysterious atmosphere all around. And exactly on such a pleasant day for dark deeds, the magicians gathered for a secret meeting in the forest. Their leader was furious that his subordinates had failed in a recent mission. Even in ancient times, dark magicians destroyed the white dragon, which guarded goodness. This is why Hieros was given the order to cleanse the ranks of the enemies hated by the emperor. But this army of magicians had only been in hiding for a while, and now they were ready for action again. That's why the loss hurt the leader of the dark magicians so much, because they had made a bad impression on themselves. The leader furiously cursed his subordinates, who had ruined such a sumptuous feast for him. But most of all, he was angry at them for not killing themselves after this noisy failure. The assistants tried to explain that they had reasons for doing so, but it was all to no avail. In the end, the man became interested in what these people could tell him. True, no fact could cancel the fact that afterward, the leader would kill every stupid magician. But the assistants did not yet suspect that death awaited them, so they started talking about Daphne Archeon. The leader was very surprised, because he was sure that this girl had long since died from the curse. But it turned out that she not only survived, but also absorbed part of the dark energy of the magic bomb. There was an incredibly powerful curse inside the lady, as it had been cast by the previous leader. So the current leader was sure that the baby would never be able to survive. He had no idea why Daphne had eventually come back to life after such a powerful curse. Now, the leader will have to kill the Duke's daughter again to prevent her from interfering with his plans. But before that, the man had one important thing to do, so he loudly snapped his fingers. Immediately after this, all the life force of his subordinates began to quickly flow to him. But the leader of the dark magicians didn't even turn around, because he didn't care about these people. He was going to find the corpse of the great dragon to put his insidious plan into action. The next morning, the Duke carefully studied the latest news that had been written in the newspaper. The journalists, led by Count Milan, did a great job, fully demonstrating Daphne's greatness. But the hero was more interested in the words that the dark magicians had finally returned from their lull. He waited for the emperor to take further action, as he had already begun to be criticized for his silence. Since there was no order yet, the man had the opportunity to sit with the lady. Daphne never woke up after the fire, even though several days had passed. For the first time in a long time, Hieros regretted that he could not experience emotions normally. No matter how hard the Duke tried to get answers from the elf, he would not tell him anything. Teiichi continued to convince the master that the baby's condition was completely under control, all because he couldn't tell that Daphne was simply recovering her strength. Suddenly, Hieros announced that if the lady could die, then they needed to prepare for the funeral. Even elves weren't so cold-blooded when it came to their family members. However, the desire to continue receiving a higher salary outweighed the pride within Insi, so he silently continued to watch Hieros, whose motives he could not understand. The man stood next to his daughter for a while, and then began to tell her how things were. What the hero remembered most was that Count Milan still wrote a lot of good things about the lady. and the Marcus Finch's family sent Daphne gifts every day as a token of gratitude for saving her. But no matter how hard the man tried, he could not share this joy with other people. The dark curse that had been cast upon him 5 years ago was still in full force. Even if the girl dies, as happened to his wife, the man will not be able to feel anything. This circumstance made Heros realize how cruel a person he was. So the hero did not regret the situation that several years ago led to a scar on his face. Then Daphne threw her first tantrum about her father, choosing her instead of her mother. But at that moment, Heros no longer felt any emotions, so he could not answer his daughter. That's why the man didn't even try to stop the little girl when she suddenly grabbed the sword. Somewhere deep down, the Duke hoped to die by this sword, just to no longer bear responsibility. However, fate decreed otherwise, and Heros still remains alive. Suddenly, the dragoness suddenly woke up, letting out a loud sigh, alerting everyone around her. Daphne immediately began to complain about a bad dream that prevented her from getting a good night's sleep. Seeing the Duke's face a few meters away, the lady cringed even more in displeasure. Heros couldn't believe that he really deserved to be treated so terribly, and the girl, without any remorse, covered herself further with the blanket, waiting for her father to leave. All because the last thing she wanted in the world was to see the Duke next to her when she woke up. Unexpectedly for himself, Heros noticed that a barely noticeable smile touched the corners of his lips. However, he soon left the lady alone, and this turned out to be not to the advantage of the weakened baby. It was all because she accidentally dropped the needed mana stone and now couldn't pick it up. The heroine had to admit that the damage to her health this time was more significant than before. But Daphne could quickly restore her strength with the help of mana stones that she absorbed. In this way, the little girl at least brought her body into order a little, which began to let her down. The heroine had planned to lie around all day, but her solitude was interrupted by one of the maids. The assistant brought the young lady delicious sandwiches, which always made her happy with their filling quality, and this time was no exception, so a cheerful smile involuntarily blossomed on the girl's face. The dragoness accepted with great pleasure all the care and respect from the assigned maids. She always liked these girls because they were polite and attentive enough. The heroine herself often forgot that her body was now human and weak. That is why attentive maids often saved the baby in critical situations. Right now, the girls were praising a young lady who had received many letters of gratitude. Unlike the sad past of the Duke's daughter, now almost everyone wanted to invite her to the ball. For this reason, the maids could finally smile sincerely when it came to Daphne. Each of them believed that the little girl had tried her best for her happy future. Celius didn't expect that she would be so pleased to see a smile on the face of her faithful assistant. But the girl's warm words warmed the soul of the dragoness, who had never been praised before. The maids did their best to take care of the well-being of the girl, who saved many people. So for the first time in her life, the lady felt what it meant to be loved by someone among people. This made Daphne want to immerse herself even more in the emotions she enjoyed so much. The little girl hastily grabbed the letters of gratitude that many aristocrats had sent. A pleasant warmth spread throughout her body as the heroine read the praise and compliments addressed to her. Previously, the dragoness would have simply burned all these envelopes without even thinking about their value. But now that she was no longer a great disaster, much had changed in the life of the young lady. Therefore, Daphne easily learned to laugh with the maids, rejoicing in her successes. Here, the assistants remembered that it was already time for Miss to return back to the annex, all because the baby was only temporarily placed in a low-security room near the Duke. But Celius had other plans, because she wanted to catch one of the dark magicians. So that night, the heroine remained in the only place her enemy could reach. And as expected, after midnight, a dark shadow slowly crawled towards her, intending to kill. Daphne skillfully pretended that she was simply sleeping, just so as not to scare off the night mercenary. And soon the man found himself right in front of her bed, making sure that the lady was alive. But he had been absolutely certain before that the girl's heart had finally stopped beating because of the curse. The dark magician was in such a hurry because he might no longer have a chance to carry out a treacherous murder. It was today that the Duke left the estate for a while, as he had been summoned by the emperor of the country. But they didn't have time to move Daphne to the annex, which was fenced off with magical barriers. Therefore, the enemy did not hesitate when he filled part of his hand with deadly dark magic. But all of this was initially a trap, into which this magician so easily fell. Therefore, the heroine barely moved her lips, calling forth a binding spell for the enemy. The man did not expect that the girl would turn out to be much smarter than he could have ever imagined. So in a matter of moments, the guy was stuck in the air, unable to even move. And Celius openly enjoyed her victory, since she could now interrogate the scoundrel. The man's eyes darted around in fear, but he still couldn't move even his fingers. And the little girl enjoyed this helplessness to the fullest, since the enemy was in her power. No matter how hard the dark magician tried, from now on, his life did not belong to him or his leader. The heroine had no intention of revealing her secrets, although she planned to simply erase the magician's memory. She didn't need his life at all, as many of the dark cult's followers might think. The magician made one last attempt to deal with the girl who had caught him so easily. However, Celius easily absorbed the spell, which could not cause her any harm. So the enemy was left with nothing, although he sincerely did not understand how this had happened. This was all because the dragoness fed on dark energy, as it came from her very essence. Realizing the futility of his actions, the man tried to eliminate himself. He directed dark magic towards his heart, which was capable of easily killing even a healthy person. But the magician miscalculated again, because the girl was not going to let the enemy go so easily. She easily extracted the remnants of dark magic from his body and absorbed it like dessert. That's why the man jumped up again, because even dying was now beyond his control. The dragoness reminded the enemy of this, informing him that his body was completely at his disposal. The dark wizard could never have imagined that he would fall into the clutches of his great deity. His actions only made the little girl even more angry, so she demanded the truth. The dark magic organization was so secret that many died for its existence. They wanted to seize power throughout the world, with the help of dark energy, which meant death itself. This is precisely why the magicians so desperately needed to kill the hero, who had long been ruining all their plans. And the first part of their plan, which involved overthrowing the dragon, had already been set in motion. But Celius couldn't allow this group to continue to rule her world. The heroine saw better than anyone else that these people were trying to go against the system of the deities themselves. They were not going to stop at anything, which is why the lady considered them so dangerous. From the magician, she was able to learn that Daphne's death would become the trigger for the group's development. This meant that at the moment, the dark mages had not yet reached their power due to Archeon. But in its current state, Celius could not resist such impudent and cunning enemies. Therefore, the dragoness had no choice but to become stronger in a short period of time. She had time to dream about how she would defeat all her enemies, thanks to the released past power. Suddenly, Teiichi burst into the ladies' room, not expecting to see the defeated magician inside. The little girl tortured the enemy so much that practically only a memory remained of him. Insik couldn't believe his eyes when he took a closer look at the body, which looked more like a real corpse. However, he had no right to object to Daphne, so he praised her excellent and skillful work. By this time, the dragoness had finished absorbing the magical energy that she had extracted from the magician. Even the elf was amused when he heard that a group of people were trying to achieve world domination. No matter how much the dragoness considered this plan impossible to implement, it was still worth being wary of the magicians. Therefore, she asked Teiichi to be more careful in future when interacting with potential group members. The heroine still considered herself an untouchable and great being who could cope with everything. However, Daphne could not forgive the magicians for trying to kill her again. But Insik was faced with an order to remove the body, something he had never done before in his life. The elf's rich imagination offered him some unsuitable options, which he kept silent about. Celius had prudently erased all of the mage's memories, so he was no longer dangerous. The little girl deliberately didn't kill him, so that no one else would dare come to her. The elf could only hope that the dragoness would continue to be kind. Here he finally remembered the reason why he had visited the young lady so late. Teiichi happily reported that he had finally detected the presence of a great sage on another continent. In fact, Insi was asking for compliments and approval from his little mistress. But in the end, he decided the best solution was to run away before Daphne got out of bed. The next morning, the commander of the knights was the first to arrive at the site. He hadn't gotten up so early in a long time, and so he was proud of his small achievement for today. Many of the Duke's knights faced misunderstanding from the rest of the aristocrats' followers, all because they had to continue to remain in the shadow of the all-time great swordsman. So the other knights boldly teased Heros' assistants, calling them a bunch of useless trash. For this reason, most soldiers ran away from training at the very beginning of the difficult training. But once Daphne appeared on the set, the formal training grew into something more. The little girl inspired everyone around her with her incredible perseverance and patience in work. Even when the lady fainted, she still got up to continue her training. And Lloyd attributed this diligence to the fact that Miss was preparing to someday take her father's place. The man couldn't contain his joy at the fact that the little girl had even recently dealt with the dark magicians. He saw how the knight's fighting spirit had risen and tried with all his might to continue to support them. The commander himself also did not forget to train, because he needed to maintain his current level. Here he noticed the Duke's adopted son on the court, who had also come for an early training session. But the boy pretended that he had woken up by accident and therefore came to the fencing ground. But from the child's face, Lloyd could see that he hadn't really come to training for no reason. The boy was still upset that all his efforts had not brought him such popularity. And the commander of the knights quickly understood Arius's emotions, that he wanted to be no worse than his little sister. However, the child did not want to admit that he felt such emotions towards the young lady. He sincerely believed that Daphne deserved her title, so he tried to get rid of the resentment. The Duke's adopted son was surprised when Lloyd reported that these emotions made him stronger. The man believed that it was worth channeling all such feelings into the sword, rather than suppressing them within himself. These pleasant words greatly supported the child, who often got lost in his thoughts. He remembered that he had never been alone, despite the Grand Duke's aloofness. Although Arius was now far from ideal, this meant that he still had room to grow. Therefore, in the future, the boy was going to become the best among the famous swordmasters. Lloyd was ready to support a child whose aspirations allowed him to achieve a lot for the rest of his life. So he smiled as he saw off the boy who ran ahead for a powerful workout. This is how cheerfully and enthusiastically everyday life now passed on the Duke's previously empty training ground. But soon, Daphne disrupted the peaceful flow of fencing as she came to the commander. The man was very scared when he saw the girl, because he remembered that she needed to rest. Lloyd could only hope that the restless lady wouldn't decide to start training right now. In fact, the heroine came for answers to questions, but did not expect to see such a strange picture. The commander happily explained that all the knights were ready to constantly practice their skills. However, Celius never saw the connection between the desire to become stronger and the state of the knights. What scared her the most was Arius, who looked like he was about to fall to the ground. The boy was trying so hard to complete the training that he didn't pay attention to anything around him. Lloyd happily praised the promising child in front of the lady, for Arius could become a swordmaster. But the man unknowingly paid the most compliments to the Grand Duke who supported them. Zelius's displeased reaction was not long in coming, because she did not like hearing about the hero. However, Daphne had no time to think about this, because she still had questions. It turned out that the little girl had decided to personally fight the dark magicians, but did not know where to find them. The heroine found it extremely unpleasant to hear that she had previously simply been lucky in defeating her enemies. After all, the girl put in a lot of effort to ensure that no one could stand in her way. Righteous anger took over Celius's mind, and she offered Lloyd a little sparring. As a result, the man had no choice but to obediently surrender to the lady. But then Befera came running to his aid, horrified that her sister had gotten out of bed. The girl hadn't left her room for a long time, but she was able to tidy herself up this time. Daphne stared at her as if she had seen a real ghost, although she was already familiar with the lady. But Arius was most surprised by the girl's appearance, because she had cut off all communication with him. But the boy missed his sister all this time, even if they were not related by blood. However, Befera ignored her brother, as she was much more worried about the girl's condition. True, the heroine received all the elders' instructions with a sour expression on her face, but the girl delighted the Duke's own daughter by bringing several potions with her. It was for this reason that Befera again dared to leave her familiar room. Celius was instantly interested in the liquid, which looked like something worthwhile. The dragoness understood perfectly well that this girl would be able to achieve great heights in brewing potions. Watching Daphne, Befera realized again how much this lady had changed. After all, before, the girl would never have helped her stepsister meet an elf. So, until the very end, the girl did not believe that Teichi would really be her teacher now. Incy couldn't shake off his arrogance, but he was to the point when it came to potions. In fact, the elf's plan was to escape after he taught this human child everything. Moreover, the beautiful Eliza once asked her daughter to look after the Duke's future heir. At that moment, Daphne was not yet born, but love for her was already growing inside Befera. That is why the girl created potions for the lady with such joy, wanting to be useful to her. As a result, the heroine had to listen to a long story about how the miss made the potions. Befera was so deeply immersed in this matter that she could talk about it for hours on end. But soon the girl herself realized that she had gone too far, so she fell awkwardly silent at the end. It was important for the green-haired lady to hear any praise from the little mistress, so she broke into a joyful smile when Daphne was satisfied with the work done. Only Arius still could not understand what was happening between the half-sisters. What bothered him most was that the girls communicated as if they had been close to each other for a long time. The boy did not expect that Befera would express a desire to act like the little girl's older sister. The child remembered that the girl locked herself in the room precisely because of the little lady's cruel behavior. But now Befera boldly showed her feelings for the little girl, without any fear of being rejected again. Arya was not used to this feeling when all his relatives looked like a real family. The only thing the boy was worried about was the safety of the research being conducted by Befera. Celius was also interested in this question. Since the girl was only practicing making potions, the boy and girl were horrified when their sister said that she had tested all the prepared potions on someone else. It turned out that the Duke's adopted daughter had tried many options to make sure that the potions worked. She did not spare herself because she was trying for her beloved Daphne, who could not be put in danger. So, in the end, Befera was completely confident that all the options she brought worked as they should. No one around expected that the girl would be so obsessed with her research. Arya had no idea how to help his sister stop experimenting on herself. It turned out that the lady had already come up with a way, because there were people who were already on the verge of death. The conversation was about the Duke's knights, who had no opportunity to refuse to take potions. In any case, the boy was sincerely glad that Befera had finally returned to communicating with people. The girl herself came to the conclusion that this was much better than sitting locked up alone. Arius lovingly hugged the two sisters, enjoying this moment of genuine closeness with them. And for the first time in her life, Zelius felt what it meant to be part of a strong and loving human family. None of the children knew that the Duke had been watching their interaction closely from the window the entire time. The assistant was not happy that the gentleman was neglecting his direct duties for the sake of the children. He was so agitated because the Duke's affairs were piling up more and more every day, and he was not sorting them out. And now the man had to decide whether he would participate in the purge of dark magicians. Many aristocrats became concerned that wizards had recently become active again. Therefore, the country's emperor gave a clear order to exterminate all remnants of dark magicians on the continent. Only this time, the ruler surprisingly spared the hero, releasing him from this mission. The whole point was that the emperor remembered how much heroes had lost because of their terrible curses. The man himself understood perfectly well that he had to avenge the death of his beloved wife due to the fault of the magicians. But the emotions inside him were still absent, so Hieros was not sure of the sincerity of these desires. Even his closest assistant could not help the master in any way, because he was not able to decide anything for him. The tender image of the beautiful Eliza has long since shattered in the hero's head due to his inability to feel anything inside. But the Duke understood that if he retreated now, he would never move forward again. The assistant wanted to support the head, but then the doors to his office suddenly swung open loudly. Only Daphne dared to burst so abruptly into the chambers of her father, for whom she had no respect. The man guessed that the baby had already reached the level where she could sense his presence. This pleased the hero, who was not at all opposed to raising a worthy heiress to Archeon. But Hieros didn't expect that the little girl would urgently demand the location of the dark magicians from him. But Celius was already burning with the desire for revenge, and therefore had no intention of retreating. The dragoness sincerely believed that she could defeat her former admirers, who suddenly became enemies. But she couldn't explain to anyone that she was also going to absorb dark energy to become stronger. The heroine had no answer to these questions, so she found herself in an awkward situation. She was unexpectedly saved by an assistant who decided that the girl wanted to achieve justice for her father. Although this proposal was far from the truth, Daphne did not try to convince the naive secretary, but his words about the little girl wanting to be like the hero made Zelius incredibly angry. However, the assistant did his job, and Hieros became interested in his own daughter's true motives. Although Daphne didn't like the stupid secretary, this time he helped her a little with the explanations, so he stayed alive. With difficulty, the dragoness still lied that she really wanted to take revenge on the dark enemies of her family. But the Duke didn't believe that the little girl, with her abilities, would be able to do anything against her enemies. If the dragoness's body had been a little older, she certainly would not have left this remark without a sharp response. But now, Daphne could only boast that she knew how to handle a sword very well in fencing. However, the Duke still offered the girl his help in this, because he was a master of the sword. But the dragoness didn't need such training even for free, so she immediately refused such a reward. The assistant immediately realized how cruel the girl had been when she left his master alone. And now, the secretary will have to personally deal with a man who, for the first time in his life, was rejected by someone. Even hours later, Daphne was angry at the hero for his proposal, since she herself was a master of the sword. Moreover, by distancing herself from her father, the heroine increased the chance that he would not recognize her as the great dragon. But the most pleasant thing for the girl was the expression on the face of the eternally arrogant Hieros. But the little girl doubted that she would ever again be able to bring the Duke to such a cheerful state. So she switched to thinking about the barriers, which were already quite stressful for her with their suppression. Daphne couldn't find an answer to the question of why the hero had tried so hard to build an extension. Only the maid opened the young mistress's eyes to this, informing her that the man had acted this way only for the sake of his daughter. The heroine would never have thought of such a possibility in her life, because it did not fit into her head. But the Duke once hired the best magicians to create all these magical barriers. The dragoness always felt like Hieros was just waiting for the moment when she would finally die because of the curse. So Celius refused to believe that a man could truly love her, albeit in his own way. However, the maid had a different opinion, because she remembered that the Duke had brought a beautiful bouquet for the birth of his daughter. This meant that the man still felt affection for the baby, even if he could not feel emotions. If Daphne were still alive, she would have been delighted with this news, but the heroine did not at all want such an outcome of events. At that moment, the commander of the knights witnessed the Duke personally arrive at the training ground. Hieros only wanted to know how Lloyd would react if he offered to teach him the craft, but in the assistant's mind, the mere mention of possible training already indicated that Hieros was in agreement. The man could not miss such an amazing opportunity, so he responded warmly to the gentleman's words. He immediately called the people together so that the other knights could also learn a lot of new things from the best swordsman. The Duke still had difficulty communicating with people, so he didn't have time to say that he had meant something else. But Archeon saw what a normal reaction of people to his proposal should have looked like. This left the man with even more questions about why his own daughter had rejected him. It always seemed to Hieros that the little girl sincerely wanted to learn something, even if she was communicating with him. Although the circumstances were strange, the Duke did not resist his fate as a teacher. Suddenly, Daphne burst onto the court and demanded that her father try to teach her at least something about fencing. This quick change of mind caused Hieros to have even more questions, as he could not understand anything. But the man rarely went back on his word, so he took the lady with him to training. In fact, the heroine had a hard time changing her mind, because she still hated the hero. However, she was influenced by the words of the maids, who were sure that the Duke had not given the lamp for nothing. So if Celius had the opportunity to experience true love, she couldn't help but take advantage of it. Inside, the dragoness remained a terrible and powerful creature that sent disasters, but Celius couldn't let Daphne lose the feeling of warmth just because she was currently occupying her body. Therefore, the dragoness was going to get as much as possible from the Duke, even if she herself did not like this option. Although the lady had explored all the surrounding areas of the estate, she was unfamiliar with this road. Noticing the little girl's curiosity, Hieros explained that he often retreats into seclusion, as his fighting is based on brute force. It was for this reason that he brought his daughter to a small training camp that was secret to him. His condition was incredibly deplorable, but that was not what shocked the little heroine so much. She immediately plunged into memories of the time when she was actively training in sword fighting. At that time, the heroine believed that she could never become attached to a mortal whose life was very short. But the old man was not afraid of the dragoness, including because he could deal with her thanks to his incredible skills. That is why this man, who did not tell Celius his name, volunteered to personally teach her his art. And all this happened in this very house, which the girl would recognize even after many years had passed. But the little girl didn't expect that Hieros would be somehow connected with the old man, who turned out to be his grandfather. Many years ago, the dragoness never had time to ask the name of the teacher who taught her a lot. Celius listened silently to his words about how she needed to continue to protect the weak. And only now was the heroine able to ask the hero what the name of his elderly relative was. It turned out that the man was Bertio Accion, and it was from him that Hieros inherited his skill with a sword. And all this time, this man said nothing about his lineage, not wanting to reveal his status. Meanwhile, if the heroine had been at least a little more attentive, she would have noticed the Archeon coat of arms in his house. Meanwhile, Teiichi was experiencing his own adventures, chasing the sage as fast as he could through the desert. As soon as the elf found the great Sio, he immediately started running away from him, not even wanting to talk. The man did not believe that the dragoness's messenger would not cause him any harm on the orders of Celius. Only when Insi was able to convince the sage of his good intentions did they finally stop. Sio himself wasn't even really out of breath after this run, despite the fact that they maintained a fast speed. Teiichi was once again surprised that this man was already over 100 years old. The elf didn't plan to have a long conversation with the man, as he already wanted to go back home. Therefore, he directly said that he came to take Sen with him to the little lady's estate. However, the sage believed that everything had its time, and it was too early for him to return. Moreover, only from a distance could Sio sincerely enjoy the dragoness's explosive nature. The elf knew better than anyone else what kind of anger Celius was like, because he had often communicated with her lately. In fact, Teiichi wished that the dragon would die and finally leave him alone. But while she was alive and well, the guy had no right to disobey even one of her difficult orders. But Sio was not averse to watching the elf die, as he had never seen such a sight before. Once again, poor Teiichi was convinced of the cruelty of the great sage, who did not want to come to his aid. But in the end, Sen mysteriously announced that he would soon return to the lady himself, as the time would come. Among other things, the sage said this because he felt sorry for this poor elf who played the role of Celius's assistant.